So I'll tell you. So I'll start by saying OpenFog is no more. So OpenFog just folded into the Industrial Internet Consortium, and just came back from that meeting last week where we brought them back in. IIC had their own edge group there, and they didn't use the fog term because people found it confusing. And then, but when we started looking at what both groups were doing, both saying the same thing.
Hello, my name is Robert Schmidt. I'm Deloitte's Chief IoT Technologist. Today on our show Coffee with Mr IoT, my guest is Chris Steck. He's the head of standardization for IoT and Industries with Cisco. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Chris, I gotta ask you, what does that mean when you're the head of standardization?
Well, mainly my job is about coordinating our strategy in standards. So you have different levels of strategy where you have the corporate strategy, product strategy, and then the piece that's missing sometimes at some technology companies is the technology strategy, because they'll inadvertently, like, their tech strategy becomes their customer's product strategy, right? You know, so sorry, I think I said that backwards, but their product strategy is actually their customer's technology strategy, and the two get conflated. But from a standards point of view, you're following more at that meta level of the technology strategy of what are the strategic inflection points, right? And then falling out of that is the standard strategy. So when somebody holds up a contribution in standards and you've got about 5 minutes to decide whether you're for or against something that's going to happen 3 years from now, because it takes about 3 years for most of these things to see the light of day, right? So, but once they're accepted, they're very difficult to get out. So that's why you'll see people stall stuff if they can't get a hold of the right person or things like that in standards. But from a standardization strategy, Cisco is such a big company that IoT is actually in a lot of different places. So we definitely have an IoT business unit that does services, and Jasper, if you know Jasper, came into. So I actually came into Cisco through the Jasper acquisition. And our kinetic services in Jasper and the industrial, the IoT switches is all in one BU. But we have aspects all over the company, and we have people that help us with the standard strategy. And there's little bits, you probably have noticed this, like this IoT isn't any one thing. Like I could just as easily be called this, standards for digitization.
Got it.
And finding out where that line is for Cisco. In some places it's vertical, where we have vertical solutions group that does like, discrete manufacturing, things like that. So we have a strategy in that space, and then there's a horizontal layer. So what I seek to do as a, computer, or as a technologist, is like how much of this is horizontal and applicable across the board, and do we drive that down? So if we find something useful in OPC, can we drive that down lower into the stack and take that into some other organization, for example? So all of that takes coordination. So circle back to your answer. So from a strategy point of view, basically setting these initiatives internally for what we want to achieve from a technology strategy, and then mapping those to individual actions and what we're going to do in the various orgs, which orgs we're going to champion, which ones we're not, and then coordinating all the contributions.
So if I try this sort of for me,
answer.
No. I have to tell you, I have like such an admiration for people like you, because the patience it takes to get standards out is just way beyond what I know. I'm not, so I have a lot of admiration for that. But what I wanted to compare that with is sort of like the idea is that if I have a Wi-Fi device and I want to connect to a Wi-Fi router, standards help me to make sure those two talk to each other without being from the same company. Same thing for Bluetooth. And now we're talking about the same idea around IoT devices. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's a fair summary at multiple levels. And I mean, one of the mistakes, like a lot of people are waiting around for one IoT standard, and they don't, like, it really depends on the space you're in. And like at Cisco, for example, I pretty much carved the world up into enterprise and industrial, or carpeted versus uncarpeted, IT versus OT, right? Just roughly, you can always find an example that violates that, but that's roughly how we map the space, and then understanding what standards make sense in a certain place. So there are places, like, again, I mentioned OPC.
What is OPC?
OPC is, I'm going to mess up the acronym, so I'm just going to leave it OPC. But basically, OPC.
It's one of those bodies, right?
Yeah, it's exactly. So they're on the the discrete and process manufacturing side. So they have come up with a generic an architecture that supports, basically now they're trying to evolve up and do a field bus on top of this architecture. And one of our main interests there is time-sensitive networking, so deterministic networking and changing the machines in the factory to use determinism on an IP bus. And we can use this TSN in other places like automotive. So there's roughly, I forget how much, but there's like several hundred pounds of wiring in a car, which if you could get it down to a TSN switch in there and some fiber, you could get rid of a lot of that, right? So we've been driving TSN, and that's a great example of a horizontal where we can apply TSN in a lot of different spaces to get benefit. But then they're specifically working in the vertical of how they're going to use it in process and discrete manufacturing inside the machines, how they're going to use it in the cars. And those are all different business units at Cisco and all different, different bodies that we have to go to and different participants.
So in a way, the work you do actually impacts people like me in a factory or even at home way down the road, right? I mean, you set standards. I talked about how it takes a lot of patience. I've been part of one organization that particularly was trying to work around standards in the home control. And, lots of people get together. There's lots of conflicting interests too on top of that. So you spend a lot of time, and it takes time to put these standards in place. And then people need to adopt those standards. So you are like 4 or 5 years ahead of what I get to see. Is that sort of a fair?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like there's a combination of things. Like at a company like Cisco, we're trying to, in the technology strategy, anticipate what we need to do even before we take things into standardization, right? And then that's where people take things in when they realize that they need a standard in this space to connect someone. The problem, Cisco is like the poster child for standards, right? Because basically the internet runs on most of the standards that Cisco donated to the industry. And that was a realization that, the problem's just too big. No one's going to single source a vendor. I mean, I wasn't there, so I can't say that, but, with any certainty, if there's any historians out there.
There's a few people that were there then,
exactly.
right?
Leave that in the comments if I'm wrong. But essentially, so this is the Cisco playbook, right, is to give those, give that into the industry and let other companies compete, right? But we assume because we're ahead, we're ready to. I mean, everybody does this. It's you donate in the common stuff that you need to do, but you try to leave a little back to differentiate, right? And that's in general that term is called the standards plus, right? So you want a basic baseline that everybody can do. But when my box connects with buy box, there's still some room for innovation. That's why there's resistance to standards sometimes, is that if you just carve take all the innovation out, then what's left in that area
it's
to make it
race
attractive.
to the bottom from there.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was my next question really. Are you in general always in favor of standardization, or are there areas where you actually advocate for closed systems?
Well,
how do you make that distinction? I'm sort of really fascinated, right? What fascinates me is I think ahead, what am I going to do? What's going to come up next year? And I realize you thinking so far ahead and you thinking through these standards, what does that mean for all the different parties at the table? So I'm kind of curious, how do you decide what to standardize and what not? And
well, I'll answer this more by like what I see than like, I don't really have an official like Cisco position on this, but what I see in general and what I've done in different places. So I've worked at various places where like we've been the leader in an area. Like there's different responses to what you want to do. I worked for a company that we had really great voice technology where we could take noise out, for example, at really high decibels. We had to get in there and change the tests so they could reflect how good our stuff was. So we had to actually get in relatively early for a startup. Because like our stuff went to 11 and you couldn't measure to 11 is what it amounted to.
Yeah.
So we had to go in and prove that what they were doing was wrong, et cetera. So there's different reasons, but had we just kind of had, if there weren't already standards in that place, because it was telephony, there's been acoustic standards for a long time, you might have waited. You might have tried to hold that as long as you can if the industry wasn't already behind it. A lot of times with standards, and I think this is something you'll actually see with IoT a lot right now, and depending on the space. with IoT, just because it's now possible to digitize everything doesn't mean all of the large players in the established space are ready to do that, right? So you have to, and people will come in because they're a startup in the space and they're like, let's just start a standard, right? And they're not going to get very far, because if they walk into one of these established places, you have to bring the larger, 800-pound gorillas with you, which have their own strategy, but they also have the customer base, right? And I'll give you a good example. In the commercial space, which is something that we're doing in Open Connectivity Foundation. We just started a commercial project. Talked to a bunch of different companies, very large companies, and they're like, love what you're doing, but we're not there, right? We're already doing these other competing standards. So they've been around for a long time. There's so when you go in and provision a building, someplace like this hotel, you just come in and you bid, and you get all 1,000 lights that are in the building. You get the heating and cooling, depending on who you are, and you own the building. And so that's the sales cycle. That's how you bid on everything. There's not a lot of pressure to move to an interoperable protocol, because that's the way they've sold for so long. Nobody in that space is in a hurry to change that, right? I mean, and why would they be, right? They're already leaders, their customers aren't demanding it. But one thing they do all want is to get onto IP networks, because what they've done for the last 20, 30 years is run their own wires in the space. So we made a change. We're like, why are we competing? I don't really care what the application level is. I wanted these guys to be using IPv6. I want them to be able to leverage this. We have great security in OCF in this application stack. We have basically an IoT session management layer. We're doing work for onboarding. So for example, when you put that light bulb in on the network, it takes a minute. Right now in that space, in any space, these guys solve it in a custom way, so they've come up with some good ways of doing it. But right now, if you take a device like a robot or something like that and you plug it in on a line, it could take you a day or two to get that thing up and running, depending on the network permissions and making sure all the security's in place. And the next one is going to take you a day or two, right? That shouldn't be the case, right? So that's one of the problems that we're trying to solve in standards, is to be able to, once you've at least done the one, you should be able to take all the policy that you just created and recognize the next one that's coming on, and if you trust it, just put it right on, right? So we've been putting standards in industry for solving that onboarding problem. That's the kind of work we were doing there that we thought the commercial industry could benefit from, but we had to back off. And OCF on the smart home side has been doing all the way up to the top level application, because nobody was really doing that. So
this is the difference between a home versus an industrial space.
Exactly.
In an industrial space, it's much easier to hold a closed system because you own the building, you can control things.
It's kind of easy in a home too. I mean, depending on how because we're seeing that on that side is it's kind of the same thing on the consumer side as well, because right now it's easier if I've got my phone from the same vendor that sold me the fridge, that sold me the microwave. There's a perception in my mind already that it's already going to work together, and if it's standards plus, like I was talking about, that you get extra features if you buy everything from the same guy. Everybody's still kind of in the same place where they don't want to be the first one to tip the commodity, right? Basically you're planning for when this happens, but you're not going to be the one that lights the match, right?
So let's switch gears for a second. I'm
Sure.
curious. You're also part of the Open Fog Consortium.
Mm-hmm.
I'm personally fascinated by fog even more than edge.
Uh-huh.
And the reason for that is that, and I think it plays great into standards, this question, by the way. Edge for me is sort of like you put a computer somewhere, you have some compute going on, and it sits close to whatever goes on, right? But fog is sort of this in between where you have a lot of little devices around that are supposedly going to work together. In a way, I almost wonder if all the things that we have around, you talked about buildings, all of them going to have some compute in there, and you want them to work together.
Yep.
Where are we going with open fog? Where do you see fog going in general? And by the way, how do you define the difference between fog and edge?
Well, So I'll tell you. So I'll start by saying OpenFog is no more. So OpenFog just folded into the Industrial Internet Consortium, and just came back from that meeting last week where we brought them back in. IIC had their own edge group there, and they didn't use the fog term because people found it confusing. And then, but when we started looking at what both groups were doing, both saying the same thing. So from Cisco's point of view, like the fog, we had basically it's a cloud that's rolled down, right? So it's the fog. So when you look at a system like Amazon Greengrass or something like that, and you have basically it's what they do in the cloud, and they just push it local, right? So the edge is kind of wherever you need it to be. Like to me, it's all multi-tier edge. So you can have multiple edges inside the factory, and as you said, like in an industry like manufacturing, a PLC, a programmable logic card that's
controller,
the controller. It couldn't do much, in the past, but now it can just be a full PC, right? It could have its own memory and storage and everything. So there's people that think of that as edge compute because it's something that couldn't be done before, right? In my mind, I think of edge compute as like one layer removed, where maybe I'm doing something on behalf of other things in the factory, and like maybe leveraging some of that space. And I think when you look at what OpenFog was doing, OpenFog was working more on those interfaces, north and south and east and west, for how you coordinate those boxes, and thinking about how I find that, if there's storage, there's that I can run these processes over here and things like that. On the IIC side, IIC is much more here and now and trying to solve immediate problems from a marketing point of view, like basically clearing out some of these obstacles so people understand what edge is. And they were saying the same thing roughly, because if you think about it, so I could have a machine that has a bunch of sensors and other devices in it, and the PLC in there that's talking to all those other devices is it's basically an edge gateway or doing edge compute. And then I move back and I want two machines to talk to each other. There's another box there that's doing edge compute. I move back at the corporate level. I move back at the whatever conglomerate level, the data center level. So basically, your edge isn't my edge. It's the way I would look at it. So basically, I move it back, and spoiler alert, it's all just distributed computing. There's like 7 problems in computer science, and we just keep renaming them, right? So this is just, as the pendulum swings one way or the other, right? So everything went to the cloud, and everything was local and being done on the smartphone. And then, when Google, a great example is speech rec, right? So then we couldn't do much with speech rec on these little constrained devices. So they basically take all the voice right back to the cloud and can do awesome things with it, right? And then we're swinging back the other way. So everybody was running to get their business into the cloud, and now some things don't make sense. Analytics, or being able to take action. If you're just counting foot traffic, that's one thing. If you're actually trying to catch a shoplifter, you better do that closer to home and catch them while they're still in the store, right? So it's really all depends on what your problem domain is, and do you need to take action? Do you need to coordinate things? And that's where these layers are. And then as I add multiple sites, that's where I would say we shift into more what OpenFog was calling fog. Does that help at all, or did I make it worse?
No. I mean, first of all, it's interesting to me to hear that a week ago OpenFog is no more as of last week, and it's now part of the IIC. So that's interesting to know. Number 2. I love that term, your edge isn't my edge, so I get that too. Yeah. And yet I remain sitting here and can't help wonder how I just see how compute and storage gets distributed out everywhere, right? And in a way, I always think of the Ciscos of the world, your company, you love that, right? They all gotta be connected and networked, and at the same token, compute out of those devices goes also away from you. It's almost like, the cloud has to succeed a little bit to the fog and the edge too, right? Because now compute happens more on those devices. But the thing that for me is missing to this point is how are they all gonna really share not just security, but share compute, share power. If I have a device that I'd like to give you half of my power, how can I give it to you in a safe way, and you're gonna in return give me storage because I needed storage, you needed compute. We can trade, right? And if you take this up to a really big, like in this room, there could be 25 devices like this. But if we don't start really having some sort of standard around it, I have to admit, so that's where I'm still stuck. And it's gonna be interesting to see what standardization does around this.
No, I think you're right. I mean, that's where OpenFog basically they were moving a little slow, because basically if you're mapping a new space, the first thing you have to do is a reference architecture, right? You basically have to draw a map of everything and how everything talks to each other, and then you start working on how to fill in all those lines that you drew, right? And that's where OpenFog was, is they'd done the reference architecture and started to come up with frameworks and best practices. And I would say, like, actually the two orgs coming together is really good, because those guys were more on the academic side and doing some work around there, and we on the IIC side, they're more marketing. So if you look at, like, I think of IIC as the marketing requirements document, and I think of OpenFog as the product requirements, and then you throw it over the fence. Like, the nice thing, IIC doesn't make their own standards per se. So what they'll do is we'll end up, both groups, like OpenFog was liaising with IEEE, and IEEE actually did the technical specification, right? So basically keeping these guys in the requirements gathering. And I think it'll be a good thing now that they're a part of IIC, because you can take it end to end and create some requirements and try to find some success, right, around, like, pick some management APIs like you talked about. Like, what's the first thing I want to manage, or do I want to be able to discover that that box has memory available and whatever it's willing to let me use and how much it wants for that, right? or any of that, right? And picking, you know, some things you can be successful, take it end to end to show customers this is what you can do, right? So I think we'll start to see some good traction in that space around that. But we're a long way away from, like, the full thing that you're talking about, where all the things can just advertise what they have available, and because it can change quickly. And then if you think about all of the attack vectors that are involved in it, not just security, but basically getting a guy to bid out all his compute right before some other big job is, you know, or something that he needs to be able to do, right? Just coming up with all that, and all the, you're trying to standardize load balancing. You're trying to standardize all of this different stuff that may or may not succeed. And then at the end of the day, most of these clouds are private. So how much of it do we actually need to do? Because if you're going to, you know, have your own corporate cloud, you're probably going to pick one or two vendors and go with it, right? And they're going to have a management solution that's in there. Or if you get a virtualization, you know, that you like, you're going to use that one throughout your entire organization. So it's a fine line of where do you stop, right? And to make it useful and to allow people to, again, to still differentiate. So.
I have to admit, private cloud was always an oxymoron to me. I always felt that you either have the cloud or you're on-prem. A private cloud is just sort of it was a smart marketing move by some folks to
I love the t-shirt that says the cloud is just somebody else's computer.
Yeah, that's true.
You're like, wow, like this huge realization.
True.
But that's what it is. Like, private cloud is like, yeah, I just bought a slice somewhere. I don't have these servers sitting in my own closet. That's
we called that hosting when I was in IT.
That's all it is.
So when I meet with people like you, and we've had meetings at Hive and so forth, I always get shown how little I know, and it's sort of really fascinating for me to sit with you and kind of think about these things. I have a question for you. How do you guide your decision making on standards and stuff like this? And what I mean by that is, there isn't a lot of people who really can understand the depth of what you have, all the different consortiums, all the different acronyms, the technical background behind that. You got to think out a few years. How do you pick the things? This is really important and I believe on this. These things aren't. And then there's sort of a little bit of almost, I want to call it an ethics kind of thought. You deal with security, you deal what's open, what's closed. How do you guide yourself around this? It's a bit of an esoteric question, I understand, but I'm fascinated by it.
Well, I think, in general, how do you guide yourself, right? Again, this is what I spend a lot of my time on, is actually lining up. I spend a lot of time going to all the different product managers and finding out what their roadmap is, where they're going, what do they see the challenges in their industry. And standards that are necessary typically come from solving a challenge, right? Like, you have an interoperability issue, or there's just no way to even get started because you don't have a common way of talking to each other, right? Even if you wanted to, you don't have a communication.
So big joint problems is one guidance.
Big joint problems are things that you're going to give to the industry right away, right? Knowing which ones are important, again, comes from listening and trying to figure out how to enable the market. A good example of one that we're just kind of unpacking. So like we'd like to, like the TSN stuff that I mentioned.
TSN?
TSN was the time-sensitive networking, so basically deterministic networking switches. And we realized in some of the places that we want to put them, well, you have to recertify these machines every time you change them. So the second you IP enable them, now you have a software update problem, right? Because, you know, and you have to do security patches and do this other stuff. So it's like, well, you know, sometimes it's just based on lead time. We know it's going to take a long time to change that process. So how can you certify by similarity or attestation or things like that, so you don't have to like be down for 4 weeks, because you'll never change that space if you don't solve that problem for them, because the main thing in manufacturing is uptime, right? Nothing ever goes down. So basically just thinking through the space and figuring out where the pain points are. And someplace it's appropriate to have a standard, and you know, sometimes it's not a standard, it's a industry coalition, you know, where like you just get together and solve problems and talk about the problems, and we're going to take 1 or 2 or 3 paths, right, on how we're going to do it. And a lot of things start with they're called BOFs, birds of a feather, and you know, getting some people together that are recognizing there's some problems, and then you think through what you're going to do in this space. I can't, yeah, you know, other than that, as far as you said, like the ethics thing, I mean, Cisco, basically, if we see a problem that's impacting a large scale people, we have our whole, you know, security team that does threat defense and things like that, and we publish, you know, if we see risks that are out there. From an ethics point of view, I mean, I think it's really hard to say, because a lot of the stuff now in that type of space comes around anomaly detection, and there's not a lot of standards around how you look for anomalies, because then they wouldn't be anomalies anymore, or the people that are making them would use the standard to create more problems, right? So I understand what you're saying, though. I don't, you know, I've never personally had that problem, because we just try to do the right thing. You know, sometimes doing the right thing very rarely goes wrong for your company. So even if you don't make a dime off of it, so.
Well, and I think just the last sentence you said is actually an interesting one, right? Because the moment you add money to it, it becomes tricky. And you just said, even if you don't make a dime off of it, then you actually know you're actually really looking for the right thing for you. So I thought it was an interesting comment. Thank you for that. I wanted to close with one last question in terms of, what can I as a consumer do to help you?
What you as a consumer? Demand more. I think would be the thing, because I think a lot of consumers don't understand how poorly secure their devices are. And my wife was begging, you know, to get one of the robot vacuums for the longest time. I'm like, I don't know if I want it, right? And because I know, like, the more I see security stuff, the less stuff I want to put on my home network at the moment, right? And when we tried to get this robot, I'm not going to say who makes it, but you know, it would not go onto my home network unless I turned off the web key, and there's no way I was going to do that, right? So I made a little hotspot on my phone, and sure enough, like, it worked right away when there was no key on the network. So, like, to be able to buy this robot that you spent $700 on, you would have to take off all the security on your network, right?
So it's really asking for, it's actually being educated.
Yeah.
And making educated choices when we go and put things into our thing. There's a bit of a responsibility. Yeah. It's a little bit like, well, we lock our cars,
yeah,
we lock our home. It's our responsibility. And so in this case, it's similar to what devices we put on.
And just because you can say, you know, Alexa or Hey Google, it doesn't mean it's secure just because it can talk to something else, right? You know, that's the voice user interface. That's like I could draw the whole cloud-to-cloud diagram on this, but basically, that's actually making it less secure in some cases, because that means that the developer had to open up a port to talk to his web service that would then talk to the Alexa skill or the Google skill or whatever they call it. And now you've got this thing poking holes. So somebody could attack that vendor, and now they control the web interfaces into the device. Somebody could go right out to the device if it didn't secure it as well. Most of these devices, you know, don't buy, you know, the consumer vigilance, don't buy things that the default is admin password, right?
No kidding.
You know, just that would be my, you know, thing, how you can help and how you can make things more secure and more standard.
And hold people's feet to the fire.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. So I want to invite you, thanks for this. This was great. I really appreciate it. It's a conversation that's challenging for me because it's really complicated, but I always appreciate talking to you. and people from the standardization organizations. Thanks for what you do. Well, it looks like our show is coming to an end. Thank you so much for our coffee chat here. Thanks for your time. And with that, if you want to see one of our past shows, please look at our playlist and join us again next week, Friday, for another coffee with Mr. IoT. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.